Daniel stood at the back of the chapel, one hand ghosting over the fabric of his suit where the note had been tucked. The room swelled with light and expectation, soft music, polished pews, the hush of gathered families, but his chest tightened as if someone had closed a fist around it. He could feel their eyes, not just the kind directed at a groom, but the small, skeptical glances that measured him for worthiness. A private inventory of success he had never asked to pass. Earlier that morning, Claire had slipped the paper into his inner pocket. She did it with a laugh that shook like porcelain, telling him to stop fretting. He joked back and promised not to lose it. But the note was more than a scrap of paper. It had her handwriting, wide, impatient loops that softened at the ends, and a line that read, "If ever you forget why you chose me, read this and remember." It felt like a tether. It felt like a question. Everyone expected Daniel to step forward and assume certainty. What they did not know, the certainty he wore was borrowed, stitched from memories of a boy who had learned how not to trust, a man who had practiced composure as armor. The chapel's light was mercilessly honest. Today would ask him more than to repeat vows. Today would ask him to become someone who could keep them. The note had appeared during the chaos of the morning, hair appointments, last-minute tux adjustments, a wrong delivery of flowers. Claire had found him in the hallway, barefoot, reading a page about rice planting in some old novel because reading felt safer than looking people in the eye. She slipped the paper into his suit, as if folding a promise into the seams. "You'll wear it for me, won't you?" she said, and the words were light but carried an ache. She was not naive, Claire's eyes rarely were, but that morning they were soft with a hope he still had trouble recognizing as belonging to him. He folded his hands and laughed, an attempt at ease, but inside he felt the old coldness pool. A photograph in his mind, a younger Daniel watching his parents' marriage unravel, adults exchanging words like glass. Another memory, a childhood friend telling him to stop being so serious, followed by a betrayal that left a scar deeper than he would let anyone see. Trust, for Daniel, had been a conditional currency. He had paid with it before and learned how quickly debts were squandered. Then came the small public rip. 3 days before the wedding, an obscure blog had published a rumor, nothing named, nothing true, but it was sticky. The headline hinted at a groom who had left another woman mid-promise years ago. The piece suggested a pattern. Daniel watched the ripples spread through their circle. A cousin's awkward smile, an aunt's probing question about the past, a colleague's uneasy text. Rumor did not need truth to hurt, it only needed to be plausible. Claire saw him at dinner that night, the way his fingers trembled as he folded the napkin. She reached across the table with a steadiness that made his panic feel selfish. "Do you?" she began. He wanted to tell her everything. About the rumor, about the contagion of doubt. He wanted to tell her about the small, internal ledger he kept of his failures. He wanted to purge the thought that perhaps he was not the steady center she deserved. But confession required a trust he had not yet learned to offer wholesale. "I'll handle it," he said instead. The words lay flat, meant for a practical world, not the interior one where thoughts rotated like a kaleidoscope and refused to settle. When the blog's rumor turned into a whispered joke at work, Daniel felt a new weight. An unexpected confrontation at the office, where a colleague with more teeth than loyalty asked with grotesque curiosity whether Daniel had really done that, left him breathing as if underwater. He walked home that evening along an avenue of lit trees and wondered if he had become the kind of man who would always be watched for falling. At home, Claire found him at the hall table, the note between his fingers. She sat, took his hand, and with startling frankness said, "Names never stay quiet for long. I will not let them make your history mine." It should have been a moment of comfort. Instead, Daniel's panic transmuted into fear that he might have to live a life defended against phantom assailants. That love, no matter how eager, would forever be policed by the past. Days blurred. Invitations were mailed, rehearsals ran against the clock, and the rumor diminished into the background noise of pre-wedding chaos. Yet every small interaction felt like a test. At a rehearsal lunch, Claire's mother offered him a fork with an appraising tilt that felt like a verdict. A bridesmaid brought up a story about an ex. Not that it matters, and the words hung like a gauze over his chest. He noted each instance with the clinical accuracy of someone cataloging evidence. Who had looked away, who had hesitated, who had offered blind support. The inciting mismatch appeared not from one grand betrayal, but from a pattern of erosion. Little looks, small doubts, an undercurrent that suggested his life might require a defense he had never agreed to build. The note in his pocket pulsed with relevance. When night fell, he slid his hand into his suit and felt the paper's edge. He drew it out and read Claire's handwriting. If ever you forget why you chose me, read this and remember. He wanted to remember. He wanted to feel the conviction his friends assumed he had. But memory, he found, could be slippery. It took a deliberate act to recover something lost. Not just the past facts, how they'd met, the jokes they shared, but the shape of a person who could believe in him. Then, a call. Claire's younger brother, Ethan, voice trembling. His lease had fallen through. He needed a place to stay, and would the wedding plan change? Daniel thought of all the dominoes this could topple. He imagined gossip seizing new threads, critics testing old stitches. He said yes, and in that simple generosity felt the strange sting of being judged as either magnanimous or weak, depending on where it was observed from. On the eve of the wedding, a less subtle voice. Evelyn, the ex who had once been a pillar in Daniel's life and a witness to his worst insecurity, appeared on social media with a vague post about unfinished chapters. It was tagged to a location 3 blocks from the chapel. The world shrank. Daniel read the post twice, then 10 more times, hunting for substance where there was none. Evelyn's comment threads, full of strangers' conjecture, felt like a slow accompaniment to a march toward a verdict he could not hear. The inciting incident, then, was not a single external event, but a constellation. The rumor, Evelyn's echo, the small hostilities of onlookers. Together they formed a pressure the wedding could ill afford. And Daniel, despite all his competence, found that pressure testing seams he had long kept private. He rose early on the wedding day, the note in his hand, and sat with his reflection. It was a kind of reckoning. How many pieces of himself could he afford to show? Could he promise, at the altar, with Claire watching, that the man she saw was the whole of him and not the carefully curated portion he allowed? The words on the paper seemed to insist on an answer. He folded the note, and for the first time that morning, spoke aloud the truth he had been avoiding. "I am afraid they will call me a story I no longer recognize." He heard Claire in his head, her laugh from that morning, and the simple request. Remember. Daniel put the paper in his pocket, not as a bandage but as a talisman. He told himself he would wear it like armor and like a promise. The ritual of dressing, button by button, tie adjusted, felt like an oath. When the best man knocked, the noonday sun caught the cufflink nearest his heart, and he walked toward the room where family waited. The chapel was a ledger of expectations. Flowers arranged in deliberate patterns, an aisle that had seen many declarations, guests in outfits embroidered with attention. Daniel's heart beat with an odd rhythm, both dedication and a nervous percussion that made him feel raw. He noticed small things with painful precision. A child staring too long, an elderly couple exchanging a conspiratorial look. Each observation fed into a private narrative he did not know how to stop. Claire arrived in a bridal car, laughing at something her sister had whispered. She was luminous without trying, as though light simply preferred to fall across her. Daniel had memorized her gait, the tilt of her chin, the steady cadence of her breath. Yet the publicness of the moment made intimacy difficult. Privacy was something they would have to rebuild after the vows. As the ceremony began, Daniel caught an eyebrow raise from his father, who had always been practical with emotion. He found comfort in the ritual. Scripted vows offered a scaffold. When he reached the place where the minister asked the question, "Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" he felt his throat pinched with the memory of past failures and the burgeoning urge to be honest, utterly and immediately. During the reception, social predators took to the room like moths to heat. People leaned in with cleverly disguised curiosity. An old associate pulled Daniel aside, mentioning in a conspiratorial whisper that past patterns can repeat. Another guest, a friend of a friend, told an off-color story about commitment and betrayal and raised a laugh that cut like glass. These comments, small as they were, landed as if they had been thrown. Claire witnessed a cluster of these moments and became a pillar of quiet fury. She confronted the subtle attacker with gentleness that made his tongue tangle. Later, when the band played and laughter resumed, she leaned into Daniel with a wordless apology, as though she could smooth the furrowed thoughts he kept digging. The tension widened when Evelyn, whose presence had hovered like fog, arrived at the reception uninvited. She appeared in a whisper of silk at the edge of the ballroom, cheeks flushed with the polite attention of someone who had timed her entrance. Their meeting was short and sharp. She moved through the guests like a ripple, brushing shoulders and exchanging smiles that belonged to a different chapter of Daniel's life. At the bar, Evelyn and Daniel came face to face, while a jazz trio stitched the night with mellow chords. Words tasted metallic between them. Evelyn's tone was casual, almost light. "You look different, Daniel." A phrase with no compliment intended, observation with a blade. He measured his reply. Old Daniel might have lashed out or retreated. Instead, he spoke with a firmness that came from the slow work of practice. "I'm standing where I chose." "You always did have a way of moving through things," she said, small venom hidden beneath. "Some people change their minds later." Before the exchange could wedge wider, Claire approached, a warm certainty around her. She extended a hand to Evelyn, civil and precise, and introduced her husband. Evelyn's smile was brittle, then genuine as she accepted. The small interaction felt like a test the couple had passed together, but the energy it released was not wholly soothed. In the days that followed, whispers climbed like ivy. Those who would gossip found a new angle. The ex had shown. Is history repeating? Even friends who meant well began to ask in strange, anxious ways. At home, the couple's private life became an internal battlefield. Daniel wanted to be transparent. Claire wanted to anchor him by insisting they speak honestly about what he feared. But his fear was not a tidy thing. It was a rhythm of memory and instinct. When he tried to map it, words refused him. He could tell Claire that he had been hurt. He could not tell her the lengths to which he had built his defenses, the daily inventory of his failings. He could not tell her he worried his love might someday be fraudulent. This gap produced friction. Small arguments erupted. Over a toasted sandwich cold on the counter, over a forgotten voicemail, over the imagined slights of in-laws. Each argument was a smoke signal of the deeper problems. Daniel found himself apologizing for things he had not done, defensive about small things that felt like proxies for his larger fear. He felt ridiculous and ashamed. There were nights when he sat on the balcony and listened to the city and thought of a boy who learned that silence could be a shield. Then came the more substantial external pressure, Claire's career shift. She was offered a promotion that would require travel, months at a time, overseas. It was the kind of opportunity she had worked toward, and Daniel loved that about her. Her ambition, her unwillingness to soften her edges to fit someone else's expectations. But the timing, immediately after their wedding, was a blow to his already fragile sense of security. The thought of nights apart after a day of being tested publicly made his gut twist. They argued in measured tones about logistics, not the principle. "I will come with you sometimes," Claire promised. "We'll make routines." "We'll make routines," he echoed, but the words felt like a hinge that might rust. The fear that haunted him wasn't simply distance. It was the sense that he might lose the daily reassurances that kept him rooted. He admitted none of this at first. Instead, he began to monitor emotions. Claire's late-night calls, the way she smiled at her boss's jokes. He found himself cataloging every affectionate text, as if tallying receipts to defend against future doubt. At the same time, Claire fought her own bruises. Her family, particularly her mother, kept making oblique suggestions about what a stable life should be. At a gathering, an aunt mentioned with a pitying lilt that marriage takes compromise. Sometimes dreams must be shelved. Claire's jaw tightened, and Daniel watched her shrink momentarily under the weight of external voices. He wanted to defend her then and there. Instead, he offered small reassurances at night, listening to her fear and reminding her of the promises she had made. The rising action crescendoed with a corrosive event. A private message from an unknown account that began to name specifics, places and dates that hinted at old patterns. It was carefully crafted to look like something from the past, and its reach began to sting those who read it. Claire wanted to answer with clarity. Daniel wanted to ignore it and hope silence would suffocate rumor. They argued about how to respond. He accused her, unfairly, of being naive in believing truth alone could withstand noise. She accused him, softly, of not trusting their bond enough to withstand the world. Then, unexpectedly, Claire did something that altered the trajectory. She organized a small gathering with friends and family in their living room. She wanted to be surrounded by people who loved them, not to parade, but to remind themselves that their life was not defined by rumor. She asked Daniel to share a story about himself. He felt the weight of the request, the uncompromising gaze of those present. He told a small, true tale about a childhood book he loved and a boy who once cried when a favorite character died. It was a small thing. It was also an offering. People responded with warmth. Tears, clumsy laughter, recollections of their own faults. For a night at least, the fear loosened its grip. Daniel slept with the note against his chest, feeling its paper warmth as though it had become a little kind of proof. The relief did not last. A week later, a colleague forwarded a forwarded message with a doctored photograph. A moment from years ago taken out of context, captions sewn to it with malice. Social media synapses sparked. A cousin whispered that maybe they should postpone their honeymoon. An old family friend asked whether Daniel had any skeletons. He had none to hide, only a history of scars and the mistakes that accompany being human. He feared that the story the world preferred was not the real one. Yet in the center of this noise, Claire continued to perform tiny acts of faith. She left notes in his pockets, grotesquely ordinary things like receipts with hearts drawn on them, a sticky note that read, "You were right about the coffee." Each note was a child bridge across a widening river of doubt. Daniel began to collect them secretly, keeping them in a shoebox by the bed. They were proof of tenderness, and he read them like prayers before sleep. Despite the mounting external antagonism, small victories accrued. A neighbor who had once avoided them now smiled. A workmate who had posted a smirking comment reached out with a private message of apology after hearing a different side. But the threats were structural now. Evelyn's occasional posts, the luridness of social conjecture, so the couple's resilience would have to be more than reactive. It would have to be proactive. Clear boundaries, honest conversation, the daily labor of faith. Daniel began to see, in the quiet hours, how much of his fear was projection. He could envision a life where his past did not name his present. He could imagine trust extended without an inventory demanded in return. Claire's note sat in his pocket like a small map. He had reached the place of decision where he either let suspicion govern his love or let love be an act he chose daily. It happened on a rain-lashed afternoon. Claire's overseas trip had been postponed at the last minute, and she returned earlier than planned. Daniel had been rounding a corner on the way to meet her when his phone erupted with a photo. Evelyn, at a cafe, in conversation with a man Daniel vaguely recognized, someone from a past time when Daniel himself had been less steady. The caption beneath was casual and insinuating. He stared at the screen until the words blurred. A voice in him leapt to life. Accusations, old and new, all braided together. He imagined the worst, a betrayal not of the present moment, but of the integrity of his capacity to trust. He wanted to call Claire, to demand context, to insist she swear that nothing would ever turn toward this script. The note in his pocket felt suddenly inadequate. Instead of calling, he stayed silent. He walked to the meeting point at the train station, rain soaking his coat, and waited for Claire. When she arrived, hair dampened, cheeks pink from the wind, she took his hands without ceremony and led him to a bench beneath a flickering lamp. He held up his phone. "Who's she with?" The question was a dam bursting, not merely factual but freighted with all his terrified assumptions. Claire looked at the phone, then at him, and exhaled. "That's just an old colleague. Evelyn runs in similar circles. It's not." "Not what?" He had the sudden clarity of someone who knows a collapse is imminent. "That she's playing with threads, that the world will use her to unravel us. Claire, every time someone posts, it feels like they're trying to make us doubt," she finished. Her tone was precise. Claire had the capacity to be gentle and unflinching at once. She had learned to say what needed saying, even if it hurt to be the one to say it. They are scavenging for drama. You know me. You know what we built. He looked at her. The rain made wet stars on her shoulders. He wanted to trust her with the kind of absolute, uncalculated trust love requires. Instead, he found the old defense rising, lists of reasons to withhold, the self-protective ledger. Then prove it, he heard himself say. The words were sicker than he intended. They were a challenge and a confession. If she refused proof, it would confirm his inner narrative. Claire's face tightened, then softened. She reached into her bag and without fanfare pulled out a small bundle of papers. I don't want to prove myself, she said, her voice low. But I can give you the truth I have. She handed him a page, an itinerary of her recent trip, receipts, emails of harmless correspondence. She told him, with a clarity that made the rain outside feel like a whisper against the chapel's stone, how Evelyn had once been a bridge in their lives. A colleague who had moved through similar social circles, not an architect of destruction. Claire's words were simple and exact. For a while, as she spoke, the flood of his fear rose and then ebbed. But the confrontation was not about evidence. The confrontation was about trust's currency. Daniel realized he was demanding an impossible proof. That love should be immolated in order to be validated. The tide of his insecurity had been fed by old betrayals, but its current now asked Claire to wade upstream, to prove affection as if it were a forensic investigation. You don't understand, he said finally. I'm not asking because I think you're lying. I'm asking because I need you to make the world stop trying me on. Claire's patience folded like a map. You can't make the world stop, she said gently, but with a hardness that was wakeful. You can only choose what you answer to. You can allow it to write us, or you can write us together. They sat with that. The rain continued to drum. The station lights blinked. Daniel felt the line between fear and action thinning like ice. If he could not trust Claire without the evidence she had offered, then the problem lived within him. If he could not decide to love without a permanent, external validation, then he had not yet chosen love at all. In the silence, Daniel did something he had never done with any consistency. He spoke the raw truth. I am afraid I'll lose you to the version of me people insist I am. I'm afraid I'll begin to perform for survival. Claire listened. She reached and unfolded his hands, which still clutched the papers like a talisman. Then let me in, she said. Show me where it hurts. Let us do the work. The confrontation did not end with a declaration of doom, nor with the instant unspooling of all fear. It ended with a covenant more practical than dramatic. Therapy sessions combined with shared calendars, agreed-upon transparency that did not feel suffocating, boundaries with the press, digital filters, and a small set of trusted friends who would speak up, and the promise to leave space for each other's ambitions. It was humbling, it was messy, but it was, finally, a plan in motion. Making a plan was one thing, living it was another. The months that followed the confrontation ranked like a slow, steady climb. Daniel and Claire set up appointments with a counselor who specialized in relational trauma and trust. Daniel went hesitantly at first, like a person entering a gym for the first time, unsure how the muscles would respond. Claire sat beside him and became both mirror and anchor. In counseling, the work was quiet and honest. Daniel learned to trace his reactions to earlier patterns. His father's stoicism, a teenage humiliation that had calcified into lifelong vigilance, an early love who had left letters unsent and promises half-made. Naming these memories did not dissolve them, but it allowed him to see the mechanics, triggers and responses, habits that felt like fate until reframed as choices. Claire learned, in parallel, how to hold space without fixing. She practiced saying, "Tell me what you need," rather than offering immediate solutions. Sometimes Daniel's need was a phrase uttered. Sometimes it was simply her presence at a moment when the world felt too loud. Slowly, the ledger they had maintained began to lose its dominion. Outside therapy, they modeled their agreed boundaries. When gossip flared, they communicated in private and refused to parade intimacy as proof. They confronted Evelyn once, calmly and plainly, requesting civility. Evelyn's response, defensive, then eventually mollified, left them with the knowledge that not all antagonists wanted the same outcome. Some were content to observe. Others sought spectacle. The couple focused on the sphere they could influence. Claire's promotion still required travel. The couple negotiated stints together interspersed with solo months. They created rituals for distance. A morning voicemail, a shared photo album updated nightly, overlapping calendars to preserve touch points. These small practices, repetitive, simple, built a scaffolding for trust. A significant moment of healing occurred unexpectedly at a friend's wedding 6 months after their own. Claire and Daniel attended as a unit that had been tested, but had not broken. Daniel, who had once been haunted by what others thought, stood at the reception and, without premeditation, gave a toast. He did not make it a showcase of triumph. Instead, he spoke of imperfection as a companion and of love as an active choice. "To my wife," he said, voice steady, "who asks me to be better than my fear." Applause, warm and genuine, lifted around them. For Daniel, this was not external validation so much as a mirror reflecting the change inside him. Their private habits deepened. Daniel started to keep a journal again, this time not to audit his failings, but to catalog moments of gratitude. Claire laughing in the kitchen, a neighbor bringing over too many cookies, the way his fingers fit into hers. The note she had slipped into his suit, the original scrap now worn at the edges, found a home beneath his bedside lamp. He rewrote the phrase into the margins of his journal until he had committed its sentiment to more than paper. The external noise decreased. The rumor that had once festooned social chat rooms dwindled as people moved on. Spectacle has a short attention span. Evelyn faded into another orbit, her posts less lancing. Those who had once gossiped apologized, sometimes privately, sometimes through small acts of reconnection. The world's appetite for drama was not infinite. Time, allied with discretion, had a way of blunting knives. Yet not all healing came from the world changing. Most came from the ongoing work, therapy sessions where Daniel finally spoke about the day his father left for good, and Claire listened without flinching. Late-night conversations where they planned futures rather than defended pasts. The decision to bring in a trusted circle who would offer candid but kind appraisals when rumor returned. There were setbacks. On a quiet afternoon, Daniel found an old email from a past partner, sent months before Claire, that suggested a possibility he could not ignore. He shared it, raw and embarrassed, and his confession bred a small argument. Claire, tired from travel and juggling duties, felt exposed. For a week they spoke in clipped sentences. It was ordinary, it was bruising. They navigated it by returning to the pact, honesty without performance. Daniel acknowledged his error, the concealment, then allowed himself to be held accountable without defensiveness. Claire, in turn, accepted his apology because she could see the effort tying itself to a new habit. Their friendship circle became a form of practice. Friends who cared for them learned how to speak up gently when outside forces fueled doubt. When an influencer began to mention them in passing, the group responded not with public fireworks, but with a carefully worded statement from someone who had been present at key moments. Small, decisive acts that preserved dignity without feeding spectacle. Time, quiet and relentless, began to smooth the sharp edges of their early anxieties. They celebrated small markers. A year since the wedding dinner with the same menu they'd had at the reception, a postcard sent from a city they had visited on their second honeymoon, a private reading of the vows with slightly different words. Each marker was a stitch reinforcing an already mending seam. Daniel recognized change in small details. He no longer counted the number of affectionate texts as if tallying proof. Instead, he read them and stored the warmth. He would still feel spikes of fear when something public surfaced, an old acquaintance posting an ambiguous line, but the response had shifted. He would pause, breathe, and call Claire before storming. He learned to ask rather than accuse. This evolution, slow, reluctant, magnificent, felt like a reclamation. At work, the shadows that once whispered about his past lost their potency because Daniel changed less for the world and more for himself. Colleagues who had once been skeptical noticed the difference. Some offered congratulations, others asked how he had managed. He answered without pretense. Therapy, practice, the simple accumulation of small choices. Crucially, Claire and Daniel began to practice celebrating each other's achievements with less negotiation. When Claire was offered an international lead role, the celebration was not a fraught calculus but a shared pride. He found ways to support her ambitions. She found ways to celebrate his quiet victories. The dynamic was not perfect, but it was honest. During a quiet late summer evening, Daniel took the worn note from the box and placed it inside a new leather journal. He flipped the page and wrote, in a hand steadier than it had been a year prior, "Remember why you chose her, because she chooses you." It was less a mantra than a vow to himself, to choose continually, not to be chosen because the world demanded it. Months turned into a slow, steady rhythm of days where fear appeared and love answered. Daniel learned that trust was less a destination and more a daily practice, an accumulation of small, truth-telling acts, the ritual of returning after being tempted to flee, and the courage to ask for help when shadows grew long. On an ordinary Sunday, sunlight pooling in their apartment, Claire reading at the kitchen table, Daniel reached into his suit pocket and found the note Claire had slipped into it on their wedding day. The paper, now softened by time, still bore the same inked loop. He smiled, not because all fear was gone, but because he could see how far he had come. He folded it beside their wedding photo and left it there to remind him that promises are not single sparks but persistent flames tended by two hands. Claire looked up, meeting his eyes. No theatrics, just the deep, composed gratitude of a life shared. Daniel touched her hand, and for once he felt the assurance not of what others thought, but of what had been quietly and truthfully built between them. It was enough.